We're here with Chuck Lauer. Thank you very much for sitting down with us. Tell me about how you got started working in the space industry.
Well, you've got Rick Tumlinson's vision of O'Neill on tape from another interview here in the conference. My epiphany on space came during my grad school days in the late 1970s. By training, I'm an architect and urban planner, and so I didn't really get into this from the aerospace engineering or the vehicle standpoint. My original intention from the grad school in architecture and urban planning was to essentially help to realize the O'Neill vision of migrating human civilization off the planet by building large-scale space cities and developing extraterrestrial resources. O'Neill was a physicist and didn't really have the experience or the vocabulary to articulate it that way. He just assumed that space solar power was space, therefore NASA was going to do it. And so all the large 10,000 person, 100,000 person, million person spin gravity space habitats populating the Lagrange points and out and beyond were conceived in O'Neill's mind to be a government program. What he was actually describing from an urban planning and real estate standpoint was the post-World War II American city building model. You find industries, you develop the infrastructure and real estate to support a population of workers that provide your basic industry, and then ultimately, like with any economy, 2/3 of the economy is just the people living and breathing and procreating and supporting themselves. And the basic industry becomes the underlying commercial reason to do it, but that is the model of our civilization for the last 50 plus years. And so coming out of grad school as an architect and planner, I decided this is what I wanted to do with my life. And so I said, well, the first thing you have to do is learn how to make a deal, learn how to do business, learn how to do financing, because money drives the boat. And so instead of going into architecture, I went into real estate development and spent about 10 years doing industrial parks, technology, commercial in Michigan, where I'm from. And so in 1991, when I started my own company and was doing consulting work, I figured, well, nobody's going to disapprove my travel expenses anymore, so I think I'll start going to conferences. And I went to the International Space Development Conference thinking that based on the title, they're talking about international space development. Turns out it wasn't really what they were talking about, but there was one paper there from a guy named Brent Sherwood, who's now a senior mission planner, executive type with JPL, but at the time he was with Boeing Huntsville doing the space station modules. And he had actually had a bit of a breakthrough with Boeing in developing a concept and presenting a paper on hotels in space. And this was in 1991 at the San Diego, I think, ISDC. And so I came up to him after his conference and introduced myself and proceeded to explain to him that he really didn't know too much about how real estate was actually financed. And so we ended up becoming very good friends and working together, and worked with him and a team from Boeing and the NASA Commercial Space Transportation Study in developing what now is the Bigelow business model, commercial facilities in orbit. We were calling them mixed-use space business parks at the time, and that's one of the chapters in the '93 CSTS study by NASA. So I got into it on the basis of the destinations and creating places in space, and not so much the vehicle. And so I was perfectly happy doing that. I knew it was a long-term expedition, and I was making good money doing real estate projects in Michigan, and so I figured I'll spend 10 to 20% of my time doing space stuff and the rest of it just doing my dirt deals. And then in 1995, I was given a talk on space business parks, at a little conference in Ames, Iowa, in middle of the frozen prairie in the middle of the winter, and this guy named Bob Zubrin comes up to me. And so he goes, well, you realize what you're doing there isn't going to be, well, it's not like going to do the Bob Zubrin. You have to, Bob, but he said, what you're doing isn't going to be happening for another 10 or 15 years. And I go, yeah, I know. I'm doing this for a long-term vision. He says, well, you do sound like you know what you're talking about when it comes to business and financing. Let me tell you about this little thing I've got called Black Colt. Which was a follow-on to the Black Horse space plane study that was done by Air Force Research Lab, he and Mitch Clapp. So Mitch Clapp was Air Force Research Lab in New Mexico, and Bob was doing this for what was then Martin Marietta, and it was a suborbital reusable space plane for launching small satellites. And it was, so this is right in the early days of talking about Iridium and Globalstar, and everybody was talking about the thousands of satellites that were going to be darkening the sky over the next 10 years, and Bill Gates and Craig McCaw are going to be putting up 1,000 satellites just among themselves, and of course none of that ever happened, but in 1994-95 it was conventional wisdom that you couldn't keep doing expendable launches. You had to transition to reusable because all this demand was going to need a new generation of vehicles. So in the 1990s, if you go back and look at Popular Science or any of the general interest magazines, there were 4 companies talking about doing reusable launch vehicles. Kistler Aerospace, Kelly Space and Technology, Pioneer Rocket Plane, and Rotary Rocket. And of those 4, we're pretty much the only one of that generation that's still alive and kicking. And the weird thing is, 10 years later, and the opportunity for COTS comes up, and Rocket Plane and Kistler merge. In the 1990s, Kistler was the 800-pound gorilla in the entrepreneurial space world. It was before called NewSpace, but all of us that were out there trying to raise money and raising single-digit and double-digit millions to go do things, and Kistler tapped into huge streams of cash from overseas, from the Middle East and Asia, and raised $700 or $800 million in the 1990s to develop the K-1 reusable launch vehicle, which is why the vehicle had matured to the point that, most of the hardware for the first vehicle was actually built. And that ultimately was what was attractive to NASA in the selection for COTS in 2006, is that it had a very high TRL because most of the stuff was built. The entire vehicle was all the way through critical design, most of the hardware was in fabrication, and the delta was figuring out how to comply with the ISS visiting vehicles requirements and be able to work with the space station as what was then the primary market, because ComSat still hadn't come back. It's been a very long and twisted path as far as answering your question about how I got into this in the first place.
That answers my question very well.